time?
I must admit I'm starting to feel quite ungrateful now because at least I've got 65 acres for my children to run around and she's got one hotel room. Did she say she had 4 children in there? Oh,
Yep.
That wouldn't be fun. So, no, what a lovely gesture.
It is... You're on the panel, INZ National. It's 5-5. Yes, it's from the first Bond movie, 1962, Dr. No. The Guardian reports that Sean Connery has been voted best Bond ever. You heard it here. With Timothy Dalton and Pierce Brosnan, the runners-up. No mention of George Lazenby, and there's one Bond left in the dust, Roger Moore trailing. So, around the panel, did they get it right? Sean Connery, number 1. Alan.
Yeah, he's my favourite. I was shocked by Timothy Dalton and Pierce Brosnan. It's weird having an Irish Bond, but I thought Roger Moore would be up there, especially with his natural Navan accent. It's a bit odd, but
I thought Roger Moore. Actually, I thought Daniel Craig number 1, Roger Moore number 2. What do you reckon, Linda?
Oh, see, I prefer Pierce Brosnan. I've always thought he was quite spunky. So just from a purely, conflict of bias, I've always thought he was the best of the Bonds because Sean Connery's just a bit too much like my dad,
Okay, well, there's one person that we are missing out that I reckon should have been on the list. Now, back in 2018, on Sunday morning, I spoke to this New Zealand actor about his audition for the iconic role of James Bond. Here it is.
No. They didn't ask me to do it, and which was just because I didn't want to do it. But I did once run across Roger Moore at a restaurant in the south of France, and he caught my eye as he was walking out. He was leaving before me, and he leant over. He said, "You should have been Bond." And I said, "Thank you very much," but it would have been a frightful gig, for me. I mean, look. My friend Pierce Brosnan was wonderful as Bond, and he loved doing it, but it wouldn't have suited me at all.
Do you know who that is, Alan?
Sam Neill.
Yes.
Yeah, he would have been good.
He would have been amazing, right?
Oh, yeah, he was perfect.
Linda, what do you think?
I don't know, see, I don't think that New Zealanders have quite the right level of grooming. I think you've got to be pretty slick to be Bond, and I don't know if any of us can quite match that.
Sam Neill is pretty slick. He would have been fantastic.
He's a little bit rural slick, though. He's a bit Aussie slick.
The same as Pierce Brosnan. They're very similar.
Pierce Brosnan, unfortunately, has been undone for me as a spunk of cinema from the Mamma Mia films. Where he sang badly. It's just ruined it for me forever.
Oh, that's shocking. That shouldn't have happened.
What about Idris Elba? Has often been named as someone who would be a great James Bond.
Yeah.
What do you reckon, Alan?
It doesn't bother me. He's even the mention of his name to any female friends, they fall. So if that's what Bond is supposed to be like, then yeah, he'd be amazing.
Big response to Rebecca Hamilton. By the way, I got the university wrong. It's American University, Rebecca is at. That woman has made me pull over the car and cry. It busted my heart open. Gratitude is a very, very beautiful thing. On that note, that's the panel for Friday. Thank you very much to Amelia Lang for producing the show, and Alan, Linda, thank you very much for being on the panel today. 5:30 is the announcement. Checkpoint till 7 p.m. See you Monday.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irarangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, 12 new confirmed COVID cases connected to the community cluster and one other probable. And it's spread beyond Auckland. 2 people in Tokoroa have the virus. So what happens next? Cabinet is mulling that difficult decision right now. Will our biggest city be longer at alert level 3 or worse? And will some regions join Auckland in lockdown? The Prime Minister is scheduled to give a press conference in about half an hour. We will bring that to you live, and we'll stay on air until 7 o'clock tonight with all the developments. We've got reporters at testing stations, and the Auckland Mayor is due to lay out the city's response to COVID as well. If you're planning to go to a weekend event, stand by for the latest on that too.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leatawa tēnei. The Ministry of Health has received reports of healthcare workers providing COVID-19 tests being verbally abused and attacked. Testing has ramped up nationwide as the country awaits the Prime Minister's announcement tonight on whether the COVID-19 alert levels will be extended or changed. A record 15,703 COVID tests were processed yesterday. The Director-General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says all healthcare workers are doing their best to help all New Zealanders.
Unfortunately, some people they verbally and physically abuse or attack staff, and it's both inexplicable but it's completely unacceptable. I recognise people's frustrations, anxiety and concerns, and I just encourage everybody to look after not only yourself and your whānau, but particularly our healthcare workers. I can tell you this, they are working flat out and many of them are very tired.
Ashley Bloomfield says it's important to note only people with COVID-19 symptoms are being tested. The next few weeks of school are up in the air for Auckland parents and teachers. Restrictions are likely to include directions for schools. One Auckland mother says if schools are closed for any longer, it'll mean another juggling act for working parents.
I can handle it. Like everyone's saying, I guess I feel a little bit, it's a bummer, I think we had maybe been hopeful we could keep it out of New Zealand. But I can kind of work from home and manage my daughters. Not going to school is hard. It's hard to work and look after kids,
More than 1 million people have now registered for the government's NZ COVID-19 Tracer app. 386,000 have signed up in the last 24 hours. Just over 170,000 QR posters have now been created, an increase of almost 33,000 in the last 24 hours. The COVID-19 Tracer app has also recorded nearly 700,000 scans in the past 24 hours. A Victorian man in his 20s has become the youngest Australian to die with COVID-19. He's one of 14 new deaths in the state. The ABC's Bridget Rollison reports.
There have been 372 new cases of COVID-19 in the state overnight. 12 of the 14 deaths are linked to aged care. There are now 659 Victorians in hospital and 41 are in intensive care. The number of active cases in regional areas is down on yesterday, with 492 infections. But Premier Daniel Andrews says he remains concerned about Geelong, Bendigo and Ballarat.
The message to everybody across regional Victoria is that if you have even the mildest of symptoms, please come forward and get tested.
There has been a significant increase in cases where the source is unknown, with another 51 overnight.
Bridget Rollison in Melbourne. Green Party co-leader James Shaw has tested negative for COVID-19. Mr Shaw was advised to take a precautionary test after developing minor cold symptoms following a trip to Auckland at the weekend. He says everyone has a role to play in keeping COVID-19 out of communities, and that includes following official health advice. National Party board member Roger Bridge has resigned after allegations he used an alias to call a talkback radio station in an apparent attempt to undermine a party candidate. The National Party president, Peter Goodfellow, says Mr Bridge tendered his resignation at a meeting of the board on Thursday, and it was accepted. Mr Goodfellow says everyone makes mistakes, and this was an unfortunate situation for someone who has given many years of loyal service to National. The man accused of murdering Constable Matthew Hunt can be named for the first time. He is 24-year-old Eli Epiha, who is charged with murder, attempted murder and dangerous driving. Mr Hunt was killed and another officer shot during a traffic stop in West Auckland in June. Mr Epiha and a woman accused of driving a getaway car, Natalie Bracken, were later located and arrested. The young man has kept his identity secret until now, after abandoning a name suppression appeal this afternoon. It's coming up to 4.5 minutes past 5. The Highlanders are preparing for a repeat of Super Rugby Aotearoa in 2021. Chief Executive Roger Clark says he can't see the team playing outside of New Zealand next year. Clark says while it's not sustainable in the long term, the competition only needs a few tweaks. Meanwhile, New Zealand Rugby is awaiting the government announcement on COVID-19 alert levels to decide on this weekend's matches. If Auckland doesn't move down from level 3, the Blues game against the Crusaders will be called off. The New Zealand motor racing driver Scott Dixon has posted the fastest lap time on the second day of practice for next week's Indy 500. Teams will receive an 80 extra horsepower tomorrow for what's known as the Fast Friday practice session.
Expect to see some pretty big speeds tomorrow, especially in toes. Everybody will be trying to get a clear track, but that's going to be tough to get. But excited for tomorrow, Fast Friday.
Scott Dixon. It will be the ultimate test of the Warriors' resurgence in the National Rugby League tonight. After their first back-to-back wins in more than a year, they face the Penrith Panthers, who are on an 8-game winning streak and 1 point off the competition lead. The NFL player Kima Siverand has been sacked by the Seattle Seahawks after trying to sneak a woman disguised as a player into the team's hotel, violating team rules during its training camp, which is operating under strict COVID-19 protocols. That's the news.
This is an official government COVID-19 announcement. The Auckland region is now under COVID-19 Alert Level 3. The rest of New Zealand is under Alert Level 2. If you are in Auckland, stay home where possible and follow Alert Level 3 guidelines. This will stop the transmission of COVID-19 and save lives. If you must travel, please stay within the Auckland region unless travelling to your primary place of residence. If you must leave home, keep a 2-metre distance from others and wear a face covering if possible. For those living outside Auckland, you must follow Alert Level 2 guidelines. For more information, go to covid19.govt.nz.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland and Coromandel Peninsula. Scattered showers clearing Auckland this afternoon and Coromandel Peninsula tonight. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay cloudy periods, showers becoming isolated tonight. Waikato to Wellington, including Bay of Plenty, Central High Country and Wairarapa. Fine apart from areas of cloud today and a few showers in Bay of Plenty. Marlborough, a few light showers clearing and fine spells increasing. Bulla and Westland, a few showers in northern Westland and Bulla, otherwise mainly fine. For Nelson, Canterbury, Otago, Southland and Fiordland, fine weather apart from a few areas of cloud. And Chatham Islands, occasional showers. RNZ National. It's coming up to 7.5 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna, and welcome to this Checkpoint special. Community transmission of COVID-19 has now spread beyond Auckland, with 2 new cases in Tokoroa. As of today, there are 12 new cases in total and 1 probable case, meaning there are now 30 cases of community transmission in the Auckland and Waikato regions. All the cases except 1 have been linked to the Auckland cluster, with the remaining case now under investigation. The Prime Minister and the Director General of Health are due to hold a press conference at 5:30 this evening to announce whether the country will shift alert levels. We will take that press conference live. Auckland Mayor Phil Goff is also due to hold a press conference just after 6 o'clock, and we'll bring you the latest from that. We'll also have reaction to the announcement from the retail sector, and we'll tell you what it means for schools and for sport. And just a reminder, Checkpoint will be live through until 7 o'clock tonight. But first, here's our political reporter, Charlie Drever.
As predicted, the number of COVID-19 cases in the community continues to rise. The Minister of Health, Chris Hipkins, says the 2 cases from Tokoroa can be traced back to the index cases. He says rapid contact tracing and testing will remain the number 1 priority.
That priority remains in Auckland, where the bulk of the cases are. That's where we're focusing the lion's share of our efforts. For the rest of New Zealand, our message remains for people to be vigilant, to wash your hands, to stay home if you're feeling unwell, and to call Healthline or your GP if you have any doubts.
Health officials are still investigating how a person who has been admitted to Auckland City Hospital has been infected with COVID-19. All but 1 of the cases can be linked to the existing South Auckland cluster, while the Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says the link with the 13th person is still under investigation.
I'm not concerned at this point because it's very early on and it's under investigation, and it was sort of the most recent case. It just made our 9 o'clock cut off.
Meanwhile, an aged care facility resident who was visited by 2 people who later tested positive for COVID-19 has returned a negative test. The 2 people who visited the Kingswood Rest Home in Morrinsville weren't showing symptoms at the time and didn't know they were infectious. Dr. Bloomfield says staff members who interacted with the visitors have also tested negative.
However, all staff and residents have been tested and their swabs are in the process of being analysed. We expect those results later today and tomorrow. The DHB is working closely with the rest home and they have all the PPE they need and other support.
Yesterday, more than 15,000 tests were processed in a single day, a new record. However, as health workers move quickly to test members of the public, Dr. Bloomfield says there have been reports of health workers being verbally abused and even attacked.
This is completely unacceptable, I'm sure you will agree. And please remember that all healthcare workers are doing their best to help not just you, but all New Zealanders. I know how hard they are working, both in Auckland and around the country, and I want to take a moment to sincerely thank them all.
He says it is important to note only symptomatic people are being tested to make sure the focus is on those who are highest risk. But as officials rush to find any possible cases, the original source of community transmission is still unknown. Genome testing currently suggests the strain of COVID-19 originated in the United Kingdom or Australia, but initial testing has not found a match between the genome of current cases and the samples that have been analysed from isolation facilities. The Ministry for Primary Industries is on site of the cold store company Americold, where at least 5 workers have tested positive for COVID-19 to try and find clues about the source of transmission. Dr. Ashley Bloomfield says nothing is being ruled out.
It will be harder probably to extract DNA out of samples in the environment, if any are found, but it's certainly part of the puzzle. Even just if we do find virus on surfaces in those cold store facilities, that may well help with the puzzle.
Cabinet met at 3 o'clock today to discuss the advice from health officials as to whether to shift or keep the current alert levels after midnight tonight. From Parliament, Ko Charlie Drever, DNA.
So, as you just heard there, Cabinet has been meeting since 3 o'clock this afternoon. Let's cross now to our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch. Kia ora, Craig. What's going on there?
Kia ora. Yes, ministers have been in a Cabinet meeting since 3 o'clock. All Wellington ministers here have been here in Wellington in the room. Other ministers around the country, particularly those, of course, in Auckland, beaming in via Zoom. It was a process that was set up during the first lockdown, rebooted now for the purposes of this one. Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, the Director General of Health, also in the room, briefing those ministers on the latest information and his advice about what to do with it. Now, it is the most up-to-date information, more up-to-date than what we heard at the 1 o'clock briefing. And that's important because there are still some unanswered questions. Out of that briefing, we did not know still about that one case which is in hospital. We did not know whether it was linked back to that cluster. They believed it was, but they hadn't managed to establish that link yet. So we're hoping that there might be some more information about that in the hours before the 5:30 announcement. Also still questions about the source of this outbreak. They have not managed to track down the origin, where it has originated from, so a big question mark there. And these are the things that the ministers will be considering, will be the factors that they'll be taking into account as they try to decide what step to take next. There are a few things, few options available, a few things that they could push ahead with. For example, they could ease restrictions, they could maintain restrictions, or they could escalate them. Easing restrictions at this point looking highly unlikely based on the latest information today. 13 new cases, 12 confirmed, 1 probable. It's looking more and more unlikely that they will ease restrictions. Maintaining them is another option. We could look at level 3 in Auckland for, say, a fortnight, level 2 around the rest of the country, or they could escalate, which is they could push level 3 out into other parts of the country, or the most nuclear option, I guess, which would be level 4. That, though, highly unlikely. The Minister of Health this morning on Morning Report told us that the only reason why ministers would put the country into alert level 4 would be if there were multiple clusters, if there were multiple unconnected cases in multiple areas. Now, that is not the situation that it appears to be at this stage. However, as I say, ministers have the most up-to-date information and they will be considering all of that before they make their decision.
Any clues as to what Ashley Bloomfield is thinking?
Well, he would not give us any indication at that 1 o'clock briefing. However, the Prime Minister was very clear early on when she laid out the plan in the eventuality of this actually playing out like what we're seeing now, and that her preference was dealing with things on a regional basis. Now, we're already seeing that in action. We've seen Auckland in level 3, the rest of the country in level 2. They seem to be downplaying the prospect that we could see other areas brought into that situation at the moment. We know that there are other areas involved. Now, 2 more cases in Tokoroa, so we've got Auckland and Tokoroa. We also know of visits from people who are positive to Rotorua, Taupo and Morrinsville. So a lot of areas there that are connected, but they all link back at this stage to that Auckland cluster, and that seems to be giving the ministers and the Director General of Health some reassurance. Dr. Bloomfield told us that 95% of cases seem to originate in the workplace or in people's homes, not through casual contact. So he seems to be reassured by that fact. Also, we haven't seemed to see yet one of those super spreader events, like something like a wedding or a concert, which would be really concerning. We've seen overseas how outbreaks can really get out of hand at events like that. We are keeping officials are keeping a close eye on a few different places, the schools that are involved, the workplaces that are involved, and also a church service where a positive family attended over the weekend. So they'll be keeping a particular eye on those higher risk areas. But at this stage, like I said, no indication of exactly what Ashley Bloomfield will be recommending. However, all these things taken into consideration.
Craig, are we expecting to get any update on the election date this afternoon?
It is an important decision and a quite time-critical one. It is hard to imagine or see a scenario where Auckland stays in lockdown for a long period of time, a fortnight or longer, and we could still go ahead with a September 19 election. We're looking at a situation where there would be no campaigning, no door-knocking, no campaign rallies in Auckland, our largest city, a third of the population, putting aside the fact that people's attention at the moment has very much been brought back to COVID-19, to the pandemic. Not much interest, I don't think, in looking at election policies and politicking and the like. So that is something that the Prime Minister will be considering. It is her prerogative. She gets to make the decision, and her alone does not need to be signed off by Cabinet as long as she doesn't push it out further than November 21st. So she can push it out to any date up to November 21st for whatever reason, and that is her decision. Now, she will be considering, like I said, all of those things. There is a lot of time pressure on her. Parliament, for example, is dissolving on Monday. It's already been delayed once, and then it was delayed, so it was delayed to Monday. If it goes past that date and Parliament is allowed to dissolve, then the power is removed from the Prime Minister soon after, and it goes to the Electoral Commission, the electoral officer, and they then may have to make a call as to whether the election can safely go ahead. Now, I understand that Cabinet is not on Cabinet's agenda today, and that the focus very much is on Auckland, what's going to happen to Auckland and what's going to happen to the rest of the country, not so much about what's going to happen for the election, although that decision will have to be made pretty promptly, more likely over the weekend than today.
Thanks, Craig. We will wait for that decision from Cabinet today on what happens in Auckland and beyond. Thanks for joining us. That is our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch, from our studio at Parliament. It is, almost 19 minutes past 5, and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. And just a reminder, we'll be on air live until 7, bringing you all the developments that we are expecting this evening. There's little to no optimism from Aucklanders that the city will return to level 2 restrictions at midnight. The city and the rest of the country is anxiously waiting on the government's decision, due at 5:30, and preparing themselves for further restrictions. John Bond reports.
With case numbers rising and spreading, Aucklanders have no expectations that level 3 restrictions will end today.
I reckon at least two weeks of level 3, maybe going to level 4 at the least, maybe a month.
I think it'll be level 4, 6 to 8 weeks, full lockdown, just in case,
So I think just 1 week, 2 weeks, more level 4, I think.
So I'd say they probably will extend it just to make sure, which I reckon is the right decision. Done it once, do it again.
The lift to level 3 was initially set down until midnight tonight. Cabinet has been meeting this afternoon, with an announcement due shortly. One man who was being swabbed at a testing centre today, Blake Derricks Wyatt, is hoping to avoid another lockdown.
I live in an apartment by myself in the CBD, so the thought of that isn't great. Yeah, not sure how I'd handle that, to be honest. It was very long and lonely isolation the first time, so I'd rather not do that again.
Central Auckland today was deserted. Even shops that were allowed to serve takeaway food didn't bother opening. There were more people at one testing station than walking around the CBD. One Auckland mother says if schools are closed for any longer, it'll mean another juggling act.
I can handle it. Like everyone's saying, I guess I feel a little bit, it's a bummer, you know. I think we had maybe been hopeful we could keep it out of New Zealand. But I can kind of work from home and manage my daughters. Not going to school is hard. It's hard to work and look after kids, you know.
In the event of longer business closures, she's wondering what might happen with a wage subsidy, due to close to new applicants on the 1st of September.
I am self-employed though, so it really does hit me hard having to work less. I mean, the government subsidy totally helps that. Then I have quite a low period over the summer, so this is kind of the time when normally I'm really busy. That makes it quite hard financially to cope.
Construction worker John Mackle says harsher restrictions won't be easy to swallow.
Yeah, I mean, not that great. We just had a lockdown, you know, so probably wouldn't be too keen at all. I'd be worried about my job and that, you know. Yeah, paying rent.
If he can't work though, he thinks he could fill the time just fine.
I got the PlayStation and, you know, I got my guitar and that. I'd be alright, bro. Wouldn't be too bad. Learn how to cook some new stuff, you know, make it work, you know.
Shortly, the Prime Minister will give some clarity to what the next few weeks will look like, both for Tamaki Makaurau and for the rest of the motu. For Checkpoint, Jordan Bond.
So how did this cluster of one Auckland household on Tuesday grow to 30 people by today? Let's take a look. It's called a cluster, but equally you could think of it as a tangled cobweb. Cases all connected by thin threads. Social circles and random encounters crossed paths that all through various degrees of separation lead back to a single South Auckland family that has COVID. So let's wind it back to the first known thread. Tuesday night, and 4 of the original family are confirmed to have COVID-19. It's announced at a hastily convened media conference.
After 102 days, we have our first cases of COVID-19 outside of a managed isolation or quarantine facility in New Zealand.
We actually have 4 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in one family. The first case to present was a person in their 50s who lives in South Auckland. That person was swabbed yesterday when they presented to their general practitioner with symptoms.
By Wednesday, the strands of that cobweb are already spinning outward. At this point, there's no further confirmed cases connected to the family cluster announced the night before. But the Director General of Health, Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, has ominous news.
There are also an additional 4 probable cases who are people with symptoms linked to the 4 community-based cases we talked about last night and earlier this morning. They are all being treated as probable cases and therefore are in full isolation, and full contact tracing has been initiated for those cases.
It's revealed members of the family, some of the original infected 4 from South Auckland, have travelled far and wide.
As a National Medical Officer of Health, I'm taking the significant and serious step of making an oral direction under Section 70 of the Health Act 1956. So, I require the following people to do two things, that is to isolate at their usual home and to not go out to work and remain isolated until they are contacted by our National Contact Tracing Service and they receive further direction.
By Thursday the 13th, there was 13 new community-based cases and 1 probable.
They are all in Auckland, and they are all linked to the 4 people who we reported as confirmed cases yesterday and the day before.
The degrees of separation and the delicate web tethering the COVID positives are tracked and analysed. A chunky distance away from South Auckland and the home of the original family, a student at Mount Albert Grammar is confirmed to have COVID-19. The thread that joins them, the student, is a relative of the Index 4, the South Auckland family.
The school has sent a letter to a number of students and a handful of staff who after inquiry, were considered as close contacts, advising them to self-isolate for 14 days.
Add to the positives 3 more workers at Americold, a cold storage company in Mount Wellington, where an infected man in his 50s from the Index family worked. And the web fans out further. 7 family members of the newly infected cool store workers now also have COVID-19.
I am now directing medical officers of health that all cases, confirmed cases, are to be managed in a quarantine facility.
Across the city in Mount Eden, an employee at Finance Now in Dominion Road, a work colleague of one of the original 4 people infected, has also caught COVID-19. And there's another strand to the web. That person has infected one of their family members.
And that brings our total number of active cases in New Zealand to 36. 17 of these are linked to the new outbreak. We are also aware that one of the people who has tested positive has visited an aged residential care facility in the Waikato.
The Prime Minister issues a stark warning.
As we all learnt from our first experience with COVID, once you identify a cluster, it grows before it slows.
Friday and grow it has 12 new confirmed cases plus 1 probable, and the infections spread outside of Auckland.
2 of the 13 new cases are in Tokoroa. These 2 people tested positive after being followed up as close contacts from a family member who is one of the Auckland cases, so part of that Auckland cluster.
The same people who also visited a Morrinsville rest home. The person they saw at the rest home is negative, but all staff and residents are being tested. One of the new cases is in Auckland Hospital, and its link to the community cluster is still being investigated. COVID has also reached Auckland's North Shore at Glamorgan Primary School, and there's cases at Southern Cross campus and Taiawhō e Poa Sese Preschool in Mangere. And RNZ understands 2 other workers at the cool store have joined the positive list.
Our National Contact Tracing Service has 771 close contacts identified, and so far we are tracing 83% of our close contacts within that desired 48-hour period.
So, as at today's 1 p.m. update, the delicate threads of the web have spun wide, and the original cluster of 4 has multiplied to 30 confirmed cases and 1 probable. And that is the anatomy of the latest cluster in the community. Just a reminder, we are standing by for the Prime Minister and the Director General of Health, who are expected to give a press conference very soon. We will go to that live. But in the meantime, we're going to the business news early tonight. Ahead of that announcement from the Prime Minister, our business editor, Giles Beckford, joins us from Wellington. Giles, there is a rebound in the manufacturing sector, the best in 2 years. But what, it's about to hit the skids again?
Well, I would think so, Lisa. Good evening to you. I realise we just do a brief report this evening. It's the best survey for it's called the PMI, Performance of Manufacturing Index, and it's the best since April 2018, with new orders driving the rise and production of goods at a 14-year high. All, of course, just reflecting the pent-up demand that there was in the economy as people got back to work and more normal activity. The survey did show, however, firms still shedding jobs, and that would be a worrisome aspect to that. Clearly not enough substance in either the recovery or in the people who run the businesses in their own thinking that they can sustain or keep staff or, in fact, hire staff. So from that point of view, you have to say that's a bit on the downside. One would think that, of course, with the developments of the past few days and with whatever we hear from the Prime Minister in the next few minutes, that will put paid to that rebound in activity for the time being. There's a companion survey coming out on Monday which covers the services sector. They are 2 of the best spot real-time indicators of how the economy is faring. If they look good, then there's a suggestion that there's a reasonable amount of activity underpinning growth. If they look bad, then it's always a harbinger that things are going to get tighter for the economy. We would expect a similar outcome for the services sector a rebound, but the reality has to be that, of course, as we move to more restrictions, even if it is just confined to the Auckland region or thereabouts, that is going to knock the stuffing out of things. The best estimates are that the move to level 3 alert is costing the economy somewhere between $300 and $400 million a week. And so you can see that any further restrictions on nationwide activity, for instance, putting the whole country into level 3, is going to be that much harder. It seems almost inevitable that, of course, the government will have to dip into its $14 billion COVID fund that it hasn't spent yet.
Giles, I'm keeping a side eye on the podium at Parliament to see if the Prime Minister is on her way. But in the meantime, could you give us a quick gallop around the market numbers?
Share market never got out of bed this morning. Caution about, of course, the virus. Sitting on the sidelines ahead of company earnings reports, which come out next week in earnest. Top 50 down 49 points, just under 0.5%, 11,450. Currency 65.3 US cents, 91.4 Australian, just touching 50 British pence. And since you seemed to balk at buying gold yesterday at $1,950, perhaps an ounce of silver at $27 might be a little bit more palatable.
That does sound a bit more palatable. Thank you, Giles. That is Giles Beckford, our business editor, with today's business news. And the Prime Minister is taking the podium now. We'll cross to that press conference.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Good evening, everyone. I want to start by acknowledging that Dr. Bloomfield has accompanied me for this press conference in order to answer any questions that may arise from this statement that I am about to make and the decisions that have been made by Cabinet today. It has been 53 hours since we moved Auckland into COVID Alert Level 3 and the rest of New Zealand to Level 2. This afternoon, Cabinet met to receive the latest information and advice from the Ministry of Health and to discuss next steps in our resurgence response plan, a plan with the primary purpose of restoring our Level 1 freedoms as quickly as possible. We have made a good start on that plan. This is what we know about the new infection in New Zealand. We have identified 29 cases. At this stage, all remain linked to one cluster centred in Auckland. One other case that is likely linked to the cluster is still being investigated. We have undertaken more than 30,000 tests in the last 48 hours. 38 people linked to the cluster are now in government-managed quarantine as a precautionary measure. There are signs we have found this outbreak relatively early in its life. While the first case we identified tested positive this Tuesday, extensive testing and contact tracing has since determined that the earliest case we have found to date was a worker at the Americold Cool Store in Mount Wellington who became sick on approximately the 31st of July. This may not yet be the origin of the outbreak, but on the information we have to date, it's the earliest sign of the re-emergence of the virus. In terms of the ongoing investigation to identify where the virus originated from, there is still no clear connection at this point. Contact tracing and genomic testing has not found a link to the border or managed isolation and quarantine facilities at this stage. The sequence of the virus from the current outbreak is not the same as the sequences from community cases in our first original outbreak in New Zealand. This suggests this is not a case of the virus being dormant or of a burning ember in our community. It appears to be new to New Zealand. In terms of wider surveillance, since I made the announcement to move alert levels on Tuesday, we have tested more people than in any other time we have had COVID in New Zealand. We have stock for a further 303,000 tests currently in New Zealand. The level 3 restrictions and the speed in which they were implemented will have made a material difference in containing the spread of this outbreak. So will everyone's compliance with those restrictions. Auckland travel data yesterday, the first full day of level 3, shows a 60% reduction in travel compared with the last 3 Thursdays, which is even less travel than at level 3 last time, which just demonstrates the incredible job that Aucklanders are currently doing. This is also what we know. We know the incubation period for COVID-19 and our experience of previous clusters, some of which reached more than 80 cases, means we can expect to see more cases as part of this cluster. It will grow before it slows, and it may continue to be linked to schools, churches and social gatherings as it has done to date. We also know, based on overseas experience and our own, that it is possible to contain a cluster or outbreak without ever being able to identify its origin. What is important is making sure that we establish the perimeter of the cluster and to stop it from growing. To do this, we do need to take into account that all-important incubation period. And so, in keeping with our precautionary approach and New Zealand's philosophy of going hard and going early, today Cabinet has agreed to maintain our current settings for an additional 12 days, bringing us to a full 2 weeks in total. Our current expectation is that by this time, the perimeter of the cluster will be identified, will be isolated, and we can move to level 2 in Auckland with confidence. That means Auckland will remain at level 3 and New Zealand will remain at level 2, the rest of the country, until 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday the 26th of August. We will, however, review these settings on the 21st of August. We want to give about a week's time to see how we are travelling before we review again. I would characterise our approach as short but precautionary hold and an ongoing investigation so that we continue to stamp out the virus. There is nothing to suggest we need to move to a level 4 lockdown at this stage, as we do not have a number of clusters or unrelated cases. I'll say that again because I've seen a lot of speculation. There is nothing to suggest we need to move to a level 4 lockdown. Cabinet also does not want Auckland to be in level 3 any longer than is needed to ensure the outbreak is managed. Our intention is that Auckland and New Zealand will quickly move back down through alert levels if we continue on this track. But it is wise to take a bit of extra time. That bit of extra time is our best way of getting out quickly. As always, the best economic response is a strong health response, and short and sharp is best. Lifting restrictions now and seeing a potential explosion in cases is the worst thing we could do for Auckland and the New Zealand economy. At the same time, level 3 does allow us to continue with more activity than a full level 4 lockdown, and I do think that's important to remember. Estimates are that the economy operates at roughly about 80% at level 3 compared to 60% at level 4. I am mindful, though, of the extraordinary disruption to business and the anxiety that this outbreak will be causing. As before, we will use what tools we have to protect jobs, incomes and businesses as well as people's health. To provide certainty to businesses and workers, I can confirm today that Cabinet has made an in-principle decision to extend the wage subsidy scheme to support businesses and protect jobs as we undertake the public health measures required to fight the virus. Finance Minister Grant Robertson will be working through the final details with officials and Minister Cipollone over the weekend. But I can say that the extension to the wage subsidy will be nationwide and will cover the period of time that the current level 3 restrictions remain in place. Minister Robertson is here, and once Dr. Bloomfield and I leave the podium, he will take the stage to give a bit more of an explanation and answer any questions you have on that. I want to touch very briefly on the activity that continues in Auckland under level 3 with the appropriate health and safety protocols in place. Auckland Transport has 44 construction sites operating under level 3. Construction continues across 5 sites on our largest infrastructure project, the City Rail Link, with about 1,200 workers. The Employers and Manufacturers Association has said many food service businesses that closed during level 3 last time are this time adapting and trading on a click and collect or delivery basis. And houses continue to be built in Auckland. Kāinga Ora alone has over 150 projects with over 3,000 units under construction. All of this is happening because of the protocols on operating safely at level 3, which includes social distancing at work sites. If you have questions over whether your business can operate, please visit the COVID-19 website or contact MB directly. To summarise, as we have said from the start, our overall COVID-19 strategy remains elimination. That requires the ongoing stamping out of the virus any time that it comes back. Together, we have got rid of COVID before. We have kept it out for 102 days, longer than any other country. We have been world leading in our COVID response, with the result that many lives were saved and our economy was getting going faster than almost anywhere else again. We can do all of that again. 1.5 million New Zealanders in our biggest city are carrying a heavy load for our team of 5 million right now. But together, we will overcome an obstacle that we knew had the potential to come our way, which is why we have a plan, why we are rolling out that plan, and why we once again can pull together to eliminate COVID. So here's what I ask today. If you're in Auckland, please stay at home in your bubble. Wear a face covering whenever you leave your home. For the rest of New Zealand, use a face covering in places where you're close to others, like on public transport. Download and use the app and make sure you can quickly access all your movements for the last 14 days in case you are contacted by the contact tracers. Businesses, please put up your COVID tracer QR code posters. And everyone, wash your hands. Stay home if you're sick. And if you're unwell, get a test. We'll be checking in again soon, but till then, stay safe, stay kind, and stay well, everyone. We're happy to take questions. Jessica.
Prime Minister, did you give consideration to an all of North Island level 3, given that we've had cases now outside of Auckland?
No, that wasn't something that was viewed as necessary, nor was it something that the Director General advised Cabinet was necessary. Of those cases that we have in the Waikato area, they have all been connected, they've all been contact traced, they've been tested, and they're in isolation. And that is part of our normal regime. We have to, of course, remember level 2 is designed to be able to coexist alongside a strong contact tracing, isolation and quarantine system. The issue is we have a larger outbreak in the city of Auckland, which is why we have high level of restrictions there.
Debate about whether it should go down to level 2, given that it has been those 12 new cases today. I guess some people were expecting that to be bigger.
Ultimately, though, what we have seen is of those cases, we are contact tracing a large number of people. And they are groups of people who, prior to the identification of these first cases, so before we were aware of them, had attended churches, had attended schools. And so we're very mindful of the need that whilst we have a small number of currently identified cases, that we need to identify the full perimeter of this cluster and reduce down its potential impact as much as possible. We were very keen to allow ourselves the time to review. If we find, for instance, over the next 7 days that the perimeter is identified, that it's well contained, We give ourselves the space to consider our settings, but ultimately, for the sake of certainty, we foresee it being no longer at this stage than an additional 12 days. Perhaps give Dr. Bloomfield a chance to speak to his advice on that as well.
Thank you, Prime Minister, and kia ora koutou. So just to reiterate the points the Prime Minister's made, our public health advice is essentially consistent with what the decision Cabinet made, which was to extend the current settings for 12 days. The total of 14 days in Alert Level 3 in Auckland and Alert Level 2 around the country is the incubation period, but more important here is we feel that will give us sufficient time to have absolutely determined the extent of the current outbreak and to have contact traced, isolated and tested to identify that and confirm that, both within Auckland and any cases further cases there may be outside of Auckland. So different from the situation earlier, there may well still be the odd case and the odd new case in 12 days' time. However, the plan now is, and the reason we have put all the effort in to strengthening our testing and contact tracing and to adding in this addition of quarantining our cases to, in particular, prevent onward transmission within households. The reason we've boosted all that is that we can contact trace and test and isolate our way through this outbreak. The alert levels provide additional assurance there. And I just want to make one final comment again on that quarantine situation. One of the bits of feedback we had is in some of the earlier clusters, we had some families, part of that Marist cluster, who ended up spending 46 days in their home environment, isolated, because they kept getting transmission within the family. So one of the key reasons we want to create that opportunity for a very managed quarantine situation for these families affected is so that that doesn't have to happen again.
Prime Minister, how likely is it that we will never identify the source of this outbreak? And can we extrapolate from your comments that, given it is a new strain and wasn't lying dormant, that it is linked to our borders?
No, because you will have actually heard me say that of the genome testing that's been done to date, nothing actually does draw that link at this stage between the case that we have and those who are genome tested within our quarantine. So at the moment, there isn't that link there. It doesn't rule it out completely, but that is what that testing has demonstrated to date.
Source.
Yeah, and so this is, we've had a number of theories that we've continued to try and chase down and that we will continue to pursue. You'll know that one that has been canvassed more broadly has been the idea of whether or not it was just a burning ember that existed in the community that now essentially has really been diminished as a potential because the strain that we have at the moment is not something that we saw originally in New Zealand. Of course, the cases at the moment are still congregating around one work site that was a cool store. There's a number of theories that exist, but not a lot of research that tells us at this point whether or not surfaces are in play or whether or not there was a connection through that supply chain as yet. We continue to pursue that, but we may not know. And so what I would prepare everyone for, we do not necessarily need to answer that question in order to contain and deal with this cluster effectively. In fact, overseas, that has been the case on many occasions, and in fact in New Zealand we've had those circumstances too.
Just that update from the 1 p.m. press conference when we weren't certain of the link with that one case is in Auckland Hospital. You're now saying that it's likely linked to the cluster. Can you elaborate on that and how and what you know?
Yes, what I can add is that there is a connection between where that person's workplace is and the Americold workplace, and it seems very likely that we will be able to connect that case back to this existing cluster, but it's still not yet confirmed.
Prime Minister, what does today's decision mean for the timing of the election?
Today, the most important focus for Cabinet and indeed for myself on the advice of the Director-General was what we do with alert levels. And so that's not a decision that I have taken at this stage, but obviously we have another 48 hours, and so I'll take that time and make sure that you hear from me further on that in the interim.
Pushing it out 12 hours means that the election on September 19th can no longer happen given the campaign.
Sorry, what was your rationale? Sorry?
12 days, sorry. Yeah.
Look, again, the focus here has been making this decision. I will make sure that we have extra detail on the question of the election, but the focus in the immediate point here has been making sure that we make a decision over what's happening for Auckland and the rest of New Zealand. One point I would make is that keep in mind, and I just add this for the benefit of the Electoral Commission, not to predetermine anything with this statement, but the Electoral Commission has done planning around offering an election within a level 2 scenario. I only say that to just remind people that they are taking precautions as well. I want people to be assured that they are thinking about the circumstances for New Zealand, whatever they may be in the future.
In the dissolution of Parliament then, so that is something you will make a decision on before Monday morning?
Of course, yes.
What happens to the rest of the country when Auckland moves to level 2? Does the rest of the country stay at level 2?
We'll make an assessment at that time. So every time we reassess Auckland settings, we'll make an assessment around the rest of New Zealand as well.
Are you firm on that August 26th date, or have you given yourself some wiggle room with the review on August 21? If the mass testing showed, that the outbreak appeared to be contained, might we move alert settings? Ease them early.
Yeah, it's a review, and so we are giving ourselves that opportunity. We did want, however, to give people a bit of certainty around the planning. We foresee, at this stage, no reason why it will be any longer than midnight Wednesday the 26th of August, but we will be reviewing in 7 days' time.
Did you discuss making masks mandatory?
No, we've had good discussion around that. Everyone was continuing to be of the view that we need to continue to encourage their use, make sure there's provision for their use, and we'll keep that under advisement. But at this stage, people were satisfied with that decision.
Did you decide not to move Tokoroa into a higher alert level, given the 2 cases there?
Yeah, at this stage, of course, those cases are very clearly and directly linked to the travel and socialising of one identified case. They've been identified through contact tracing. They were proactively tested through that process and then isolated and quarantined. So that has actually been all in keeping with our plan as cases emerge or if we have an outbreak. The reason we've treated that differently to Auckland, of course, Auckland is the source. It's where we're predominantly seeing the infection. It is where we're primarily still determining the perimeter of the cluster. But Director General.
Can I make an additional comment on that? One of the things that's really encouraging in this outbreak is not just the testing that is happening, but how early on in their symptoms people are coming forward to be tested. So the cases in Tokoroa came forward to be tested on Tuesday, symptomatic, even though their exposure had just been on the weekend. And so this is a really critical measure for our success in being able to rapidly identify cases, isolate them, and then contact trace. And as I said at 1 o'clock, we already know that of the many hundreds of people we have followed up as contacts, we've had over 83% of them contacted and isolated within that 48-hour period, which is great.
Yeah.
So don't we have to identify the source of this in order to have confidence that we won't see a repeat?
No, not necessarily. What also gives us confidence is the wide range of testing, and you will see here the fact that we've had 30,000 tests and are still identifying cases that are all traceable and connected to this cluster. So that's one thing that gives us confidence. Time gives us that additional confidence, because if there were additional cases, we would start to see those arise as well. And thirdly, our own experience. We have had clusters before where we haven't always been able to identify the source, and indeed overseas you see in the likes of, from memory, Dr. Bloomfield, Germany, I believe, has had clusters they've managed and contained where they haven't always been able to identify the source. It is still preferable, and we will continue all of the investigatory work to try and determine that, but it may be the case that we don't, and that wouldn't be a reason not to lower our alert level.
Yeah. What are the latest modelling numbers you have?
Well, actually, the most recent conversation I've had with those who have been talking to our modellers is that clusters aren't actually an easy thing or something you can successfully model. because everything is unique to that cluster. It's when you have wider outbreaks and multiple clusters that the modelling's more accurate. So the caution I've been given is that modelling is unlikely to be able to predict what we would see here. We can rely, however, on past clusters just to get a sense of how they tend to behave and the scale of them. And we have seen in New Zealand clusters that can get up to the 80, 100 mark. Is that a fair reflection, Dr. Bloomfield?
On the election question,
yes.
One of the options obviously is you have available to you is just to leave it to the Electoral Commission because they have the powers to defer. Would that be a prudent course of action given that would take the politics out of it?
Yeah, look, again, as I say, the most important, and I think it's not an unfair statement, the most important thing for Cabinet and indeed myself today, because that is where the decision over the election date at the moment falls. You're right to say that down the track it would fall to the Electoral Commission. At the moment, my focus was simply on making sure that our resurgence plan was in place, that we're doing everything that we need and we have the settings in the right place. I've got another 48 hours, I'm going to use it, and I'll come back on the question of the election.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Who are you bringing into your confidence? Who will you consult with over the election day?
Oh, well, ultimately, it's something that falls on my shoulders. I am aware, though, of the Electoral Commission's view and all of the issues they have to factor in. It's one of the reasons I did highlight that they have done preparatory work around the different settings New Zealand might be in. But I did make sure that I was briefed by them in that regard yesterday afternoon so that I can factor all of that in my thinking. Brett?
Just in terms of the difficulty with the modelling, but
yes.
Do you then have milestones, though, that you can look at in terms of working out whether this particular cluster is coming under control, where you feel comfortable about dropping down the levels?
Yes. Dr. Bloomfield, because he has to use that information to give advice to us.
Yeah, so I think the critical thing is the pattern of the spread that we see over the next, and the cases we see over the next 7 to 12 days. And the sort of settings they are occurring in. So partly it's about the number and also whether there is geographical containment and or whether those cases and or their close contacts have been in settings where there could have been further spread, like churches or schools and so on. We've seen that already. So again, it's looking at the pattern, geographical and those sorts of settings, the number of cases, the links between them, and also we'll also be looking for the rate of growth. We're growing quite quickly at the moment. We'll want to see that level off.
Yeah. One of the things we have discussed, though, is that don't expect that we have to see, for instance, 0 cases at all in order to move levels. It is something that we've discussed. Of course, our regime has to be built for us to be able to exist in a level 2 environment with the management of cases. What we will be looking for, though, is just to really have a sense that we've got what I'm calling the perimeter of the cluster under control. I'll come to Jackson.
Prime Minister, it's obviously still early days, but all of the cases except the one still under investigation can be linked to the same cluster. Have we dodged a bullet here?
It is heartening to see at this stage that linkage between all of those cases. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We've always taken a precautionary approach, because if you make a wrong move with COVID, we can see very easily the long-term impact of that, and particularly in terms of how long, as a consequence of the wrong move, you can spend with restrictions. And Australia, has demonstrated that to us. So we are looking at the experience of others and making our decisions.
Situation in Melbourne playing in influencing your decision to go hard very early?
We're evidence-based, and so you would expect us to look overseas at what other experiences have demonstrated, the likes of Hong Kong or the likes of Australia, where they have taken a little bit more time and existed with a more open environment while they've determined a perimeter of an outbreak. Our view is it's better to assess that with restrictions in place, so ultimately you can get back to freedom faster. That's our approach.
30,000 tests. Sorry.
Yeah, well, sure.
Thank you. Of the 30,000 tests, what portion were done in Auckland?
Forgive me, I don't have a breakdown with me here. I do know that we have that, though, by DHB. We can provide that. I wouldn't be surprised if it's provided publicly.
Yeah, my understanding, it's about half of them, so at least 50%.
Yeah.
After the 1 p.m. update, were you provided details of further testing results, or are you still relying?
We're sticking to the 1 p.m.
further positive?
I would say that there's, again, the pattern that we're describing here has not changed.
On the wage...
So the pattern of the cluster has not changed.
On the move to a level 4, what are the criteria or the thresholds we should watch for if we need to go?
A good question. Nothing obviously that we're seeing here, but you'll remember that the criteria for level 4 is, multiple outbreaks, multiple scenes of community transmission, just a much larger scale than what we're dealing with here. Yeah.
Just on the extension of... Does this set a precedent? So... just on the extension... Just on the extension of the wage subsidy scheme, have you got any indication about how much extra that's going to cost?
I don't want to steal the thunder of the Minister of Finance, who will take the podium immediately after we've completed questions. But remember, we do have an underspend currently for the second extension. We had an estimate that it would be roughly 2.6 to 3.9 billion in terms of the drawdown on that. It's actually come in closer to 2. So there is already an appropriation that we can draw on for a wage subsidy extension.
With a third of the population now in much more severe restrictions for a much longer time, could New Zealand still consider itself a team of 5 million?
Yes. Not everyone in a team is on the field at the same time. And, some of us currently are on the sidelines really rooting for those who are experiencing those that level of restriction. And that's why I just asked the rest of the team to be really supportive, just to be mindful of that. If you know people in Auckland, particularly if you know people who are isolated, do reach out to them. Level 3 is not the same as level 4 though. We have a much higher rate of economic activity, much more people who are safely in the workplace, but that doesn't mean that there won't be people experiencing loneliness, anxiety and hardship. So we do need to make sure we look after each other.
Does this set a precedent here so that people can understand how future decisions will be made? So if 4 cases show up in Dunedin next week, could they anticipate 2 weeks of level 3?
No, not necessarily. And of course, we still apply to these decisions the framework for our levels, and they have a description over under what circumstances we would move either regions or the country. And so again, what's happened in the Waikato fits with level 2. We know that they're linked, they're contained, they're isolated.
It's a similar scenario, a cluster, what appears to be an outbreak, an unknown outbreak, beginning of another cluster in Dunedin in a week's time. Should they expect to move to level 3 immediately?
Again, very much depending on the scenario, because at the moment what we have is we don't have the beginning of the chain, which creates much more uncertainty. If you have the beginning of the chain, even that changes some of the decision making. So that's why when we developed our resurgence plan, it was based on a range of different scenarios, because it ultimately will come down to what you're experiencing, where the chain begins and how wide and connected the clusters are. But covers it.
Are you satisfied with the rigour of restrictions on movement outside of Auckland? There have been reports of not insignificant amounts of people flying into places like Christchurch and Queenstown. Might the government sort of intervene and
So one of the things that we did last time was we did allow enough time for people to relocate. And so that sometimes took a little bit longer than when the orders came in. What we're going to do over the weekend is look at the way that this is operating at our road checks, and we'll also have a look at the way aviation is working. I'm picking up on some of the anecdote that we're hearing, so we will reflect on whether or not we need to look again at the way we're operating that at the aviation border.
Just on that, do you have any evidence yet in terms of whether those passenger flows are tracking with what you would expect for purely residential movements, people returning?
Well, we know that from within Auckland, it's actually lower than it was last time we were in level 3, so that gives us something about the intra-Auckland regional travel. I don't have the data around between regions, but it is something we'll look at, and we are over the weekend reviewing some of that. Just mindful of the time, I'll take a couple more questions and then hand over to the Minister of Finance. Jenna?
Mine can go to the Minister of Finance, it's okay.
Okay, great.
Are you happy with today's decision? How did it stack up with the advice that you gave Cabinet this afternoon?
Oh, well, as I said earlier, it follows very closely the advice we gave, actually. And I should say that whilst the advice is under my name, it's not mine alone. I had a conversation this morning with my Chief Science Advisor, Dr. N. Town, Dr. Caroline McElnay, the Director of Public Health, and they had worked with our team. We're in constant dialogue with the Public Health Unit in Auckland, meetings with them at least twice, if not 3 times a day. So it's a full range of advice from a lot of good people. The Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor has been actively involved in the discussions as well. So I think there was a very strong consensus on what our public health advice was, and that's very much informed the Cabinet decision.
Then it's our job as a Cabinet to balance that against the economic impact on the Auckland region and the rest of New Zealand as well. And that's what Cabinet's job is, to then weigh up those two decisions. But our view is a strong health response is the best thing we can do for the economy. Benedict.
So was it unanimous at the Cabinet table today?
Yes. Benedict.
What was your view on the interview that Winston Peters gave last night to Australian television?
You will have already heard me speak to what the evidence is telling us. And the evidence is telling us at the moment that none of the genome testing that's been carried out to date and that is available to us of those cases we've had in our managed isolation can currently be linked back to the cases we have. And so that's the evidence that we have, and so that is what I'll be basing all of our decisions and assumptions around. Justin.
Bloomfield, is there any health advice that Cabinet has decided not to follow?
You mean today? No.
No, I don't think there's many generally, actually. I think that we're reasonably responsive. All right, Gina, last question.
Was it irresponsible for a Cabinet Minister to put information into the public that hadn't been provided by an official source?
I believe that he was reflecting information passed to him from a journalist, so perhaps we could ask the question equally on that side as well. I'm going to hand over to last question, Jackson. I'll be generous.
Did the Deputy Prime Minister apologise to you?
Oh, look, I haven't asked him to, nor would I expect him to. He is free to give his own interviews. You can expect that I will continue to just reflect back what the evidence is showing. That is what we rely on to determine where the source of this is. And as I've said, although we haven't yet found that source, we will continue looking very, very hard, despite the lack of a current link. I'll be asking the Minister of Finance, Grant Robertson, to take the podium, and we will have another update tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
And the Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, is just making his way to the podium, and we'll cut to him live.
As the Prime Minister has indicated, today we have made an in-principle decision to extend the wage subsidy to cover the period of the current Level 3 restrictions. I just want to talk about some of our thinking behind making the extension to the wage subsidy nationwide. Auckland represents a significant part of the New Zealand economy, nearly 40% of GDP. As a result of that, and the Auckland economy's connections with the rest of New Zealand, it is clear that a Level 3 situation in Auckland will have impacts on the rest of New Zealand. That's not only in terms of business and trade activity being connected throughout New Zealand, but also the fact that we're asking Aucklanders to stay home and the impact that will have on tourism elsewhere in New Zealand. We are already hearing reports of cancelled bookings, and that is having an impact on regional economies throughout New Zealand. A lot of businesses outside of Auckland rely on customers from Auckland. So making the wage subsidy nationwide is also a recognition of that and the alert level 2 settings, which have an impact on hospitality and retail businesses in other parts of the country. And we want to make sure we're helping to cushion the blow for these businesses as well. I can also confirm today that we are looking to changes to other existing schemes as part of our plan to support businesses through this outbreak. In particular, Cabinet has also agreed in principle that we will make changes to the criteria for the COVID leave scheme to improve access to it. We want to make sure that anybody who has been asked to stay home because they are required to self-isolate or because they are immunocompromised has the confidence to do so, and they know that they will be looked after regardless of where they work. We are doing this in part to emphasise the importance of getting tested and then self-isolating if you test positive. We do not want people to be afraid to get tested because they think their livelihoods or income or job may be at risk. This is about having the right settings for this situation. We've already shown that we can get the support to businesses quickly to help cash flow and confidence, and this will be the same this time around. Details, including the specific criteria and audit activities for this, will be announced on Monday. Our expectation is that access to the scheme will be very similar to previous criteria. The Ministry of Social Development have indicated that they will be able to implement the new wage subsidy scheme within 5 days. It is also very important to note that applications for the current wage subsidy extension are still open and expire on the 1st of September. I encourage all businesses to check if they are eligible, even if they thought they previously were not. Outbreaks like this are exactly why the government prudently held back money in the COVID fund to support the economy in the event of a further rainy day. We also have money remaining in the wage subsidy scheme and leave support scheme allocations that will be able to help meet the costs of this scheme. We will announce the details of an extension to the mortgage deferral scheme as well. That was already announced in principle by the Reserve Bank Governor. The final details will be operationalised and we'll be able to put them out into the public arena on Monday as well. This is all.
And that is the Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, announcing that there will be an extension to the wage subsidy scheme, and they're expecting more details on that to come out by Monday. He's also going to modify the COVID-19 sick leave scheme to make it more accessible. The mortgage deferral scheme has also, there's an agreement in principle to extend that existing scheme, that so households can take a break from mortgage payments. It was due to expire on the 27th of September, and we'll hope to speak to the Minister a little later in our extended program. But we have just heard there from the Prime Minister and the Director General of Health, Dr. Ashley Bloomfield. Auckland is going to be in lockdown level 3 for an additional 12 days. The rest of the country will stay at level 2. Now, joining me now is RNZ's health correspondent, Rowan Quinn. Rowan, can we just recap what the health reasons were, the factors that have led to this decision? What did they look at?
Well, the Prime Minister is saying there it's about the same cautious approach that they applied, and then as a result we all applied last time the country locked down, and that's about trying to contain this cluster, which is what it is in Auckland, and to stop the spread of it. So she says, the incubation period of the disease is about 14 days. We've already locked down for 3. 12 more days to go gives a little bit of time to see if they can track down more cases, and they think that there will be more in this cluster. And they're saying that that's the most important thing, is to contain the cluster. It's also they would like to find the origin of this current outbreak, but that's actually not the most important thing. The most important thing is about stopping it spreading, and that's what this extra 12 days they hope will do.
So we're keeping in pace with the life cycle of the virus, in essence, the incubation period. People will be scratching their heads. Tokoroa, 2 cases today confirmed in Tokoroa after contact with people who were infected in Auckland. So why not a ramp up in levels in that part of the country?
Well, we heard from both the Director General and the Prime Minister that that's because the 2 cases there are clearly linked to the Auckland cluster. At the moment, there's no sign of any further spread, and they also are keeping an eye on the cases there as well. So they're saying there's no need to push Tokoroa into level 3, and it's sort of a similar rationale perhaps for why they're not pushing Auckland into level 4, which is a question that people have also asked, and that they're both saying there, that the Director General and the Prime Minister, that it's because there is one cluster that we know of at the moment, and so they're able to track it quite well. Level 4 would be if there were many random cases, if there were multiple clusters, if there was a larger geographical spread.
Obviously, Dr. Ashley Bloomfield said there that the numbers are growing quite quickly, and he would like that to slow down. So let's look at some of the new information that they have. First off, one of the cases from today that is confirmed, a person in hospital. What do we know about that?
That this is a person who is... We didn't know for sure whether they were linked to the cluster, and now we know that it's much more likely that this person is linked to that cluster. So we have 29 people in the current cluster, or 30, and that was that last person that they were a little bit unsure of. Can't totally lock down to say that they are part of the cluster, but it's now looking much more likely. So that's good news, I guess.
We know that the family of 4 in South Auckland who tested positive for COVID on Tuesday, they're considering them the index case. But what have we learnt now today about perhaps earlier infections?
Yes, well, it sounds like there was a case, the Prime Minister saying there on July the 31st. So that's a long time, several days, almost a couple of weeks before the original index case. So, and that's connected to the Americold cool store, which has been connected to a lot of these cases in the cluster. So that's really interesting. They're not saying yet that it's definitely the original source. And we know from talking to the health experts that when that family was discovered, that they were very unlikely to be early on in the chain of transmission. That there could be 1 or 2 or 3 generations of the virus before it got to them. So then it looks like here's at least one that's quite a way back.
Okay, the other thing that we've all become more familiar with is this term, the genome. So it's like the fingerprint or the DNA sequence of the virus. Again, we've got a bit more information, don't we?
Yeah, that's been something that's been new with this outbreak, really. We didn't hear a lot about it in the last outbreak. The Prime Minister's saying that the genome testing of the virus and the current cluster is not associated with the earlier community outbreaks from our last lockdown. So she said there's no sign of burning embers or a dormant virus, or the word she used. But they also said there's no link to any of the current cases in managed isolation or quarantine, but that they are still investigating that. So still a bit of a mystery, but some things clarified about the genome.
Just before you go, can you give us the dates so that people know that the date for coming out, and she was going to, reconsider it before we actually get to that deadline?
That's right, yeah. So August the 26th, we're in lockdown, level 3 in Auckland and level 2 for the rest of the country. That's 12 more days. On the 21st, as in keeping with the government's plans in the last lockdown, they're going to give us a little bit of a heads up of whether we'll be coming out of that or not. And the Director General said a lot of the decision about that will be on the pattern of spread that we see of the virus in the next 7 to 10 days.
Thanks, Rowan. That is Rowan Quinn, our health correspondent. While Aucklanders have continued to flock to COVID testing centres around the city today, and our reporter Nita Blake-Person is at Eden Park, where a new testing centre was set up today, and joins us now. Kia ora, Nita. What has the demand been like there?
Kia ora, Lisa. It's been massive. We know that 30,000 tests have been carried out over the past 48 hours across the country, with at least half of those in Auckland. And here at this testing centre, they've been absolutely inundated. People were still trickling in here until about half an hour ago. An hour ago, they had about 115 cars still waiting and about 40 people in line. Over the past hour, they've got that down quite a bit. Last I checked a few minutes ago, it was 66 cars and about 15 people. So they are moving quickly, but there is huge demand for these tests. They actually turned away about 100 cars, not necessarily turned them away, but said Henderson didn't have as much demand. So they recommended people go there. They're just trying to organise people at different centres across the city to try and avoid those bottlenecks, but there is certainly a lot of people getting tests today.
And tell me, Nita, what's the mood been down there? Are they quite patient, waiting?
Everyone I've spoken to has been in really good spirits. There's obviously a lot more links to this cluster, so people have different reasons for being here. Most of the people I've spoken to have either been symptomatic or they've had some connection or reason that they thought they needed to be tested. One woman, not so much. She said her flatmates threatened to kick her out unless she got that test. There's obviously a lot of anxiety around this. So there were some people a little bit nervous about being here today, but really, really grateful for the service they were receiving, and also all the staff in really good spirits. Unlike, we heard from Dr. Ashley Bloomfield earlier today that some people had been verbally abusive towards staff, but certainly no evidence of that here.
I don't know if you've had a chance to chat to people, Nita, because it's not long happened. The news that Auckland has got another 12 days at this level 3. So what do people make of that?
Well, I took a quick wander along the walk-in kind of queue at a safe distance to ask people, quick straw poll, what they thought, and there was a lot of nods and kind of, I guess, more of a resignation. I think I asked them before the 5:30 announcement what they thought was going to happen. Most people were preparing for level 4 or certainly an extension, so this didn't come as a shock to them, and it seemed to be that they thought that was the right decision given the number of cases which keep emerging.
Thanks, Nita. That is Nita Blake-Person, who is at Eden Park, where one of the community testing centres was set up. It is a new centre there today. And now let's go to our reporter, Nick Trubridge, who has been to a media conference with the Auckland Mayor, Phil Goff. Hi, Nick. What has the Mayor had to say this evening?
Hi, Lisa. Well, yeah, the Mayor Phil Goff's press conference is still going, but the main message from him tonight has basically been that Aucklanders have beat this before, and that they can beat it again. He's just reiterated, I suppose, some of the health messages also from the Prime Minister and Dr. Bloomfield that, if you're feeling sick, call your GP, speak to Healthline, and go and get a test. He did, though, say that we can't, it's obviously not sustainable to continue locking down. To quote him exactly, we can't continue to lock down indefinitely. So I suppose, encouragement that Aucklanders have beaten this before, but sort of a word of warning that we can't sort of just keep going back into lockdown.
So, Nick, has he got to the point where he directly requests money from the government? Has he covered that yet?
He hasn't covered that yet. Obviously, he's thanked the government for its, the continued assistance that it's looking into, but hasn't covered off that particular point yet.
Appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us. That is Nick Trowbridge, who has been at a media conference with the Auckland Mayor Phil Goff. It's still going on, so if there are developments from that, we'll bring them to you live as well. The Health Minister has given assurances that most frontline border staff will have been tested for COVID-19 by the end of today. There's been confusion over testing of staff who work at the borders and in isolation hotels following revelations that more than 2/3 of them have never been tested for the virus. Meanwhile, health officials have yet to pinpoint the source of the community outbreak in Auckland. Anusha Bradley reports.
This morning, the Health Minister said testing was only mandatory for border staff with symptoms of COVID-19. But at the 1 o'clock news conference, Chris Hipkins said testing was now compulsory for workers who came into direct contact with passengers, and most would be tested today.
There are over 280 staff who work on the front line of the border at the Auckland International Airport. Over the last 24 hours, on-site testing has ensured that most of these staff have been tested, and the few remaining to be tested will be done so over today and tomorrow.
That hasn't always been the case. A border worker who did not want to be named told RNZ that until now, testing for staff has been completely ad hoc.
We have been on at them about getting a regular testing program. There has been sporadic efforts to place testing units at the airport randomly, but there is no protocol or procedures around you must be tested every week or every fortnight, or it's all the onus is on the individual whether they pitch up to a testing station.
She says many staff have not had proper training in infection control, and she's seen cleaners armed with only gloves being exposed to potentially contaminated material.
So yeah, they put their arms right in the bin, right up to their armpits, and pull out used gloves, ear probe, thermometer covers, potentially highly contaminated items. So that things like that are a worry.
The Ministry of Health did not respond to questions from RNZ about the lack of PPE or infection control for staff at the border. The National Secretary for Unite Union, Jared Hare, says managed isolation and quarantine hotel workers have also raised concerns about the lack of regular testing.
This lack of clarity is the problem in itself. If people don't know what the system is or know what's supposed to happen, then when the system fails, no one actually picks it up.
Chris Hipkins says testing for hotel workers has since ramped up.
2,459 people who work in managed isolation or quarantine facilities. Of those, 1,435 have been tested in the last 48 hours.
Increased testing of port staff is also underway, and Dr Ashley Bloomfield says Ports of Auckland is a particular focus as officials try to figure out the source of the latest cluster.
We have been rolling out testing at the 17 ports around the country, and Auckland was one of those. And the testing over this next few days is because Auckland is clearly where this outbreak is. So we want to test border staff at both the maritime and air border, but also, yes, as part of our investigation, just to follow that chain of the Americold goods that might have come in through the port and been transported to that Mount Wellington depot. So
Dr Bloomfield says COVID-19 tests in Auckland are being prioritised as they try to pinpoint where the community transmission of the virus originated from. For Checkpoint, Anusha Bradley.
In breaking news, the Super Rugby Aotearoa match between the Crusaders and Blues, scheduled for Eden Park this Sunday, has been cancelled. The game was a sellout. More than 43,000 tickets had been sold. We will have more on this later in the programme. It is 23 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. And just a reminder, we are on air until 7 o'clock this evening to bring you the latest developments and information around the continued lockdown level 3 in Auckland and level 2 for the rest of the country. 12 more days we're going to be doing this. So level 3 is to continue, as I said, in Auckland for another 12 days at least. So how will this affect schools? Tim O'Connor is the headmaster at Auckland Grammar and joins me now. Tim, what are your biggest concerns with this?
11 full school days out of the classroom will be expensive, particularly for those students who are sitting examinations, within 27 working days from returning on the 27th of August. 27 school days after that, Cambridge examinations will start, and of course that'll be a hell of a lot of work for us to be able to get those students on course so that they can experience some form of success in those exams.
So when you say it's going to be expensive for this, you mean in time lost, do you? The face-to-face support from teachers?
Yeah, the face-to-face, we can continue with the online components, of course, and can get students content. But the difference between having a teacher in front of these students and giving them the urgency that is required and the support that they'll require, that you can read in a face-to-face situation, then you can't do in an online situation. We need our seniors back to school as soon as possible, and I've asked the ministry when we're going to receive some information about that sort of time frame. The last time we had level 3, there was an opportunity for us to, it was recommended that 3rd and 4th formers, or year 9 and 10, returned with a 2 metre physical distancing. No reason, and from our point of view, that we couldn't return between 500 and 1,000 seniors on our campus and meet physical distancing requirements and obviously health and safety protocols.
So Tim, in essence, you're asking for an exemption, are you, for these kids who are really at crunch time for what is a very big deal for them?
Yeah, I'm asking for an exemption for all 6th and 7th form students across wider Auckland. If schools have the ability to provide a safe environment for them, why would we not continue having those students in our care again?
So what has been the response so far from the ministry?
In all fairness, they've been waiting for tonight's announcement like all of us, and I've communicated with the ministry since that announcement was made, and they're working to see whether there will be any flexibility. So I'm hoping that we will get an announcement on that overnight, because it'll take us 2 full days. We'll work through the weekend to put structures in place that would mean that we could actually operate in a safe capacity while doing the very best for the young people in our care.
Do you think it's going to be a wasted year for some of these kids?
I don't want it to be. That's the critical thing, and I guess that's the thing that I've been nervous about since we went into when schools were closed on Wednesday or Tuesday night. It has been the thing that I've lost sleep about is the good average students who we need in front of us right now, because we can make a difference to them and the success that they experience through every day counts basically from here. This is a critical time in the academic school year for them.
Appreciate your time this evening. That is Tim O'Connor, who's the headmaster at Auckland Grammar there. He's really seeking an exemption to bring back some of his senior students, as he laid out there. They're at crunch time for exams that come not that long after the level 3 lockdown ends in Auckland. Now, we heard from the Prime Minister a short time ago. It's 12 extra days at level 3 in Auckland, and for the rest of the country at level 2. Joining me in the studio again is our health correspondent, Rowan Quinn. Rowan, the Director General of Health has said that tracing tracing is going to be really significant in terms of controlling this cluster and the geographic spread. What's going on?
Well, that's right. That's about all getting us out of level 3 as soon as possible. And so what contact tracing is, just a wee reminder that it's about finding everybody associated with every person who comes down with COVID. So anyone else that they could have infected and getting them shut down as soon as possible. The country is apparently in a much better position to contact trace than it was when the first outbreak came. So they've already contacted 700 people as a result of the current cluster, and they were looking for 700 people and have contacted 500. So what the experts tell us is when it comes to contact tracing and containing an outbreak like this, there is a little bit of luck involved, and that's that you hope that there's not a big party involved, like, say, the Bluff wedding or some of the school that we saw.
Because they have mentioned a church gathering, haven't they, Rowan?
That's right. We don't know too much about that one yet, but there is a suggestion that one of the families involved in this cluster may have attended a big church. It's obviously a different scenario than a wedding where people are socialising and mingling around and drinking. You're sitting in your rows in the church, so it's a different story. But the hope is, in terms of the spread of this and trying to contain it, that there isn't a big cluster like that.
Okay, we're about a minute away from the headlines here, but I think it's probably important to remind people what they're supposed to be doing. So shall we address Auckland at level 3? What did the Prime Minister, she went through a bunch of messages for us.
She did. She has said that you stay home if you can. In most workplaces, it would be, you would be at home. Wear a mask, that's a new one from last time. Socially distance as much as possible. Of course, no one's allowed to leave Auckland, and we've got all the police perimeters up around the border. What else? Am I missing any, Lisa?
The only other one was the QR codes, wasn't it, for the businesses? They need to get a trot on and get their QR codes.
That's another new one, isn't it? They must have their QR codes, and the rest of us are supposed to be downloading the app, and a lot more people have been doing that over the last 48 hours as well.
Yeah, and I think her final words were stay safe, be kind, and some other similar themes. Stay well, I think it was. Thanks, Rowan. That's Rowan Quinn, our health correspondent. And coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, if you are just joining us, Auckland will remain in level 3 lockdown until midnight on Wednesday, the 26th of August. The rest of the country will remain in level 2 for the same period. That's an additional 12 days. The Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, will join us live shortly on extending the wage subsidy. In the meantime, we'd love your feedback. You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us, Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. We are here until 7 o'clock tonight. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the announcement this evening. But first, here's Susanna with the headlines.
Auckland will remain in COVID-19 alert level 3 and the rest of the country in level 2 for another 12 days. Cabinet has decided to keep the current alert level settings in place until Wednesday, August 26th. However, the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, says a review of these alert levels will take place next Friday, the 21st. She says it appears there's been a good start to containing the Auckland cluster, but more time's needed to make sure it's been brought under control. Ms Ardern says there's nothing to suggest any part of the country needs to move to level 4 lockdown at this stage. She says moving alert levels in Tokoroa, which has several positive cases, wasn't necessary because those cases are linked to the Auckland cluster. The government has agreed in principle to extend the wage subsidy scheme for the whole country. Finance Minister Grant Robertson says details will be finalised over the weekend, but it will cover the period of time that level 3 restrictions are in place. The Prime Minister says she will use the next 48 hours to make a decision on moving the September 19 election. Jacinda Ardern says the Electoral Commission is preparing for the possibility of an election being held in New Zealand if New Zealand is under alert level 2. She says there are still 2 days when Parliament is due to be dissolved before she needs to make a decision on moving the election date. The Ministry of Health has received reports of healthcare workers providing COVID-19 tests being verbally abused and attacked. A record 15,703 COVID tests were processed yesterday. The Canterbury District Health Board has lost a 5th senior executive with the resignation of its Chief Medical Officer, Dr Sue Nightingale. New Zealand Rugby has announced Sunday's Super Rugby Aotearoa finale between the Blues and Crusaders has officially been called off. Tomorrow night's Highlanders Hurricanes match in Dunedin will be played, but without fans, and with the kick-off time moved forward to 3:05 p.m. Those are the latest news headlines on RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 7.
Thanks, Susanna, and kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Just a reminder, we're on air until 7 o'clock this evening with this Checkpoint special. Further vital financial support will be provided to businesses affected by the COVID-19 restrictions. The wage subsidy and mortgage deferral scheme will be extended, and COVID-19 sick leave will be tweaked to be made more accessible. Well, joining me now is Finance Minister Grant Robertson. Good evening, Minister. To start off with, the decision to extend the alert level for 12 more days in Auckland, was that difficult given you know how much businesses are struggling?
Oh, look, good evening, Lisa. Look, obviously we weigh up against the different issues that are put in front of us. Clearly there are the public health issues and they are significant, albeit that we are doing a pretty good job of managing this cluster for now. But we do weigh that against the economic issues, and it's the very reason why we made the decision today at the same time to extend out that wage subsidy scheme as well. So we know how tough this is on businesses, but we have never wavered from the view that the best economic response is a strong public health response. I believe that's already been borne out in what's happened in New Zealand. We've stuck to that, but we've also come along with further support for businesses.
Did anyone disagree with the 12 days?
No.
Okay. So, where have you identified the most immediate need for supporters?
Well, obviously it is about the businesses who have not been able to open, and level 3 in Auckland will mean that for a number. Others will be opening in very restricted circumstances. But one of the things we identified pretty early on when we were considering this week was that we couldn't really put in place a regional scheme, either administratively or because actually a lot of businesses outside of Auckland rely on Auckland, be that tourism businesses in the regions waiting for Aucklanders to come down for a break, or those who supply into Auckland. Obviously also level 2 itself provides some restrictions, particularly around retail and hospitality. So when we put all of that together, we concluded that a nationwide wage subsidy extension was the right thing to do.
I know you're still working through all of this, but where do you reckon the threshold is going to be? And will it just be for the extension, the third tranche, if you like, just be for this 12 days?
Yeah, look, we're working through the detail of that, as you suggest. It will be relatively similar to what's come before, because actually tweaking the criteria would only slow down the ability for us to get the money out the door. MSD have said once we make the final call, they can get it out within 5 days. One point to bear in mind here is that the first of the wage subsidy extensions is actually still available for people until the 1st of September. And for some businesses, they may not have thought they were eligible. That required a 40% reduction in revenue in 30 of the 40 days prior to applying. I think for a number of businesses now, they may well actually find that they are eligible, so they can get in and apply for that right away. This scheme is then available, the one we've announced today is available for people whose extension has already ended, or perhaps they didn't take up the extension. So once all of that's happened, we'll be able to give a firmer idea of the total cost and so on. But eligibility-wise, we'll make those final decisions on Monday.
But are you thinking you'll stick with around the 40% loss?
Yeah, look, probably it'll be a decision either between the 30 or 40%. The 30 was the initial scheme, the 40% was the extension, but we just wanted to do a little bit more work over the weekend to look at some of the details of the impact, also talk further with our business leaders in Auckland, which we've been doing through the week as well.
How much of your $14 billion that you've got in your little kitty for dark times are you prepared to put to this?
Well, obviously the estimates on that will be finalised once we've got the fine detail of the criteria, and it depends a little bit on how much is used from the existing scheme. We do have money left in that allocation, nearly $2 billion left in that allocation, and so we believe that may well end up being sufficient, and we won't need to dip into the $14 billion. But putting the $14 billion aside was for this circumstance, so if that's necessary, we will do it.
Given that obviously you've got to work out where best to target your support and who to help, did you give any consideration this afternoon into letting the South Island go to level 1?
That wasn't. That wasn't something that we went into a lot of detail on. We were concerned to make sure that we stuck with the original decision we'd made, in part because obviously, while the cluster is contained largely to Auckland, the people involved have travelled, and for example, they've travelled to Rotorua or down to Taupo, and that means that there is the possibility that there have been other people around them who may have picked up some kind of infection. So we felt that the prudent thing to do was to stick with level 2 for the rest of the country. You would have heard the Prime Minister say that after 7 days we are going to review the decision that we've made. One of the reasons for that is to see whether or not there is any spread outside of the Auckland area, and that gives us some flexibility should we choose to revisit that decision after 7 days.
Potentially, by going a third round here, are you just delaying the inevitable? Because, how long can you afford to keep saying, we'll just do one more lot of wage subsidy, we're going to have to do another one, maybe we'll do another one? That's not sustainable, is it?
Well, obviously, we bear that in mind as part of the decisions here. I think the decision to move up to level 3 was very influential because level 3 does reduce the activity in the economy. It's clearly only been designed for the period of time that we're in level 3, so it's a short amount of time, and therefore we think it is sustainable. And obviously for a lot of businesses, they're making their decisions and their plans looking a substantial distance further ahead than that. But we felt this was the appropriate thing to do, particularly given it's Auckland, and Auckland does have such a significant say in the overall economy of New Zealand.
So how many more times can you afford to do that, though?
Well, it's not really a matter of that. That's not how we're looking at it. It's about the specific circumstances that are in front of us with this set of restrictions. We put that $14 billion aside to be able to deal with second waves, and so we'll be careful about the way that we deal with that, but we think this is the appropriate decision for this particular circumstance.
Also, the COVID benefits. So this was the increased amount of money for people who had lost their jobs due to COVID, right, from March to the 30th of October. Do you anticipate an extension for that particular payment?
Not at this time. That's not something we're considering. That payment is obviously still available for people who are losing their jobs at the moment, and so it has, a little over 20,000, perhaps up to 22,000 people who've drawn down on that now. But no, we have no intention to change that. The other element that we did make decisions about today at Cabinet is the leave scheme, and we do want to make that leave scheme more accessible. We want to make sure that nobody thinks that if they did a test and then it turned positive that somehow or other that would leave them without a livelihood or without a job, particularly for people who perhaps exhausted their sick leave requirements already. So we're going to be looking at some modifications to that scheme over the weekend to make it more accessible for people.
Thank you for your time this evening. That is the Finance Minister, Grant Robertson there, just detailing the extension to the wage subsidy and other financial support which the government will be putting in place, final details of which he hopes to reveal on Monday. Shops in Auckland will only be able to stay open if they can demonstrate that they are complying with public health protocols under level 3. That's things like click and collect, so there's no contact with customers. Greg Harford is the Chief Executive of Retail New Zealand, and he joins me now. Greg, obviously the government's announced this extension to the wage subsidy. How much is that going to help?
It is certainly really good news that the government's come out with confirmation it will extend the wage subsidy. We're really happy to hear that. I think key to that, though, is how it's going to set the criteria for the new extension. Previous wage subsidies have been tied to turnover performance over a particular quite limited period, and the threshold's been set quite high. But the cumulative impact of the economic disruption of the last few months means that we really think that, at least for retail and hospitality, the government needs to take a pretty liberal approach.
So talk us through that then, because obviously this is not our first rodeo. So how hard is this for businesses right now, in Auckland in particular?
It's very, very difficult. Retailers in Auckland, yes, they're able to sell online and they're still able to do contactless click and collect, but that will be leading to a collapse in revenues of approximately 80%. So 80 is a big number for businesses to be losing out on. And it just makes it really hard to keep trading. And in some cases, it may not even be worth opening the doors. So government support to help those businesses through the next couple of weeks is really important.
What are you anticipating in terms of businesses going to the wall and jobs lost here?
It's a little bit early to say on that. Government support obviously will help manage that situation. The wage subsidy over the last few months has been effective at keeping people in employment, and it's encouraged businesses to keep people on their books, so that's really good.
But do you anticipate, Greg, this is not going to be enough for everyone?
I think that's right. There are going to be businesses that just don't make it through, and that's why it's important too that government support looks beyond wages. There's a number of fixed costs that retailers keep incurring, even if they're not able to trade properly, wages, insurances, rental costs and so forth. And it would be really good if the government could come to the party with some support to help retailers through that as well.
So how agile have retailers been? How easy is it for them to adapt and to go contactless? Do you know how many of them are able to do that?
It's pretty difficult for a number of retail businesses to go contactless. And of course, it requires customers to want to shop like that as well. One of the issues is that if you're running an e-commerce site, for example, you might be doing 10 or maybe even 20% of your business online, but your customers don't necessarily want to shop like that. They prefer to come into store. So they're not necessarily going to be interested in those contactless technologies, even if the retailers are nimble enough to have them in place.
Thank you for joining us. That is Greg Harford, who is the Chief Executive of Retail New Zealand there. It is almost, 16 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We're with you until 7 o'clock this evening. And we've got some breaking news just to hand. The Australian government's inquiry into the ill-fated Ruby Princess cruise, which visited New Zealand, has identified serious, inexcusable and inexplicable oversights by New South Wales health authorities. The vessel, owned by Carnival Cruises, visited 5 New Zealand ports in early March before returning to Australia. More than 600 people connected to the ship later tested positive for the COVID-19 coronavirus and 10 died. If you are just joining us, Auckland will remain in Level 3 lockdown until midnight on Wednesday, the 26th of August. The rest of the country, including the Waikato, will remain in Level 2 for the same period. That's an additional 12 days. The Prime Minister made the announcement a short time ago.
In keeping with our precautionary approach and New Zealand's philosophy of going hard and going early, today Cabinet has agreed to maintain our current settings for an additional 12 days, bringing us to a full 2 weeks in total. Our current expectation is that by this time, the perimeter of the cluster will be identified, will be isolated, and we can move to Level 2 in Auckland with confidence. That means Auckland will remain at Level 3 and New Zealand will remain at Level 2, the rest of the country, until 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday the 26th of August.
Jacinda Ardern said the decision would be reviewed a few days earlier on August 21. She said Cabinet had made the call because after 53 hours in lockdown, health authorities had been unable to trace the origin of the Auckland cluster.
We have identified 29 cases. At this stage, all remain linked to one cluster centred in Auckland. One other case that is likely linked to the cluster is still being investigated. We have undertaken more than 30,000 tests in the last 48 hours. 38 people linked to the cluster are now in government-managed quarantine as a precautionary measure. There are signs we have found this outbreak relatively early in its life. While the first case we identified tested positive this Tuesday, extensive testing and contact tracing has since determined that the earliest case we have found to date was a worker at the Americold Cool Store in Mount Wellington who became sick on approximately the 31st of July. This may not yet be the origin of the outbreak, but on the information we have to date, it's the earliest sign of the re-emergence of the virus.
The Prime Minister said the strain of the virus identified this week is different from the original strain and is new to New Zealand. She said that indicated to authorities the virus had not been dormant. Travel was down 60% yesterday compared with other Thursdays, and Jacinda Ardern said that meant Aucklanders were heeding the message to stay at home. She had a message for the 0.5 million people living in the city.
If you're in Auckland, please stay at home in your bubble. Wear a face covering whenever you leave your home. For the rest of New Zealand, use a face covering in places where you're close to others, like on public transport. Download and use the app and make sure you can quickly access all your movements for the last 14 days in case you are contacted by the contact tracers. Businesses, please put up your COVID Tracer QR code posters. And everyone, wash your hands. Stay home if you're sick. And if you're unwell, get a test.
The Prime Minister said a decision as to whether the election scheduled for September 19th would be shifted would be considered over the weekend. Now, in breaking news, Auckland schools will have to wait another 24 hours to learn how the extended restrictions of Alert Level 3 will affect students and crucial learning. Earlier, we heard from Auckland Grammar's headmaster, Tim O'Connor, concerned about the lack of direction from the Ministry of Education in relation to how schools should respond to the extended Alert Level 3 restrictions. We have just heard that Ministry of Education has emailed all Auckland principals to say they will give them guidelines tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. Across the Tasman now, and Victoria has recorded another 372 new cases of coronavirus today, a jump of almost 100 on yesterday's lowest figure for weeks. The state also reported 14 more deaths, including a man in his 20s. So-called mystery cases are continuing to be a challenge for authorities, with another 51 linked to unknown sources today. Victoria Premier Daniel Andrews once again called on all Victorians to get tested, even if they have the mildest of symptoms.
We have more than 60 regional testing sites, and we'd be very grateful to anybody with even the mildest of symptoms to come forward in regional Victoria and indeed right across Melbourne to get tested. It's a really powerful contribution that you can make towards our collective fight against this wicked enemy.
And Victoria's Chief Health Officer says 20% of Victoria's second wave of cases come from unknown sources. Brett Sutton says a delay in symptoms can often make it difficult to trace the origin of infection.
For 1 in 5 cases, we can't determine that. And that'll be for a number of reasons. They just simply don't have anyone else in their household who's been unwell. They can't identify anyone in their workplace who's been unwell. The places that they nominate don't have existing cases, clusters, outbreaks. And so we can't determine absolutely where they've got it from.
A growing number of mystery cases in New South Wales also has authorities concerned. Today, 9 new infections were recorded in the state, a drop from the usual daily total in the teens. Right, as we went into level 3 lockdown, people were warned not to panic shop. The supermarket and essential service will still be there every day, open for your needs. So let's go now to Kitty Hannafin, who is the spokesperson for Countdown. Hi, Kitty, what's demand been like?
No, demand's pretty heavy. It was very heavy on Tuesday night and Wednesday morning, and no, it's actually been very steady, not as bad as Tuesday night and Wednesday morning, but no, it's solid demand right across New Zealand.
And how are people behaving themselves?
It's a mixed bag. We've had a pretty tough day today, actually, right across New Zealand with behaviour in our stores, which is disappointing. So it's a mixed bag, up and down. We're seeing the best and the worst of people.
So when you say some of the behaviour was a bit disappointing, can you give us an example? What are your staff faced with?
Well, we've had some spitting today and lots of verbal sort of assaults on our team, throwing stock. Kind of a little bit of what we saw last time, some pushing and shoving, some altercations between customers in the car parks. I think stress levels are high.
What was that over? What was that over, Kitty? Was that about getting in the line or what?
I don't know, actually. No, I don't know.
So did you have to call police in at any stores?
Yes, we've had police in across New Zealand today, and I have to say, incredibly responsive and quick responses. So we're very grateful for that. But I've been into stores in Auckland, and people in Auckland, or the stores I've went to today at least, are wearing masks and shopping very calmly. So yeah, we're very grateful for that.
Just remind us, what limitations are there on certain items?
Yes, so immediately on Wednesday morning, as soon as we opened, we put limits in place on all of the items that we saw sort of fly off the shelf last time. So pasta and rice and long life milk, canned spaghetti and baked beans and frozen vegetables, sanitizer, period products. So we've got limits on those products and on face masks. It's just one box. And that's just so simply we don't see trolleys of pasta go out the door, and it means that people can come and get what they need, and that's really worked. So we haven't had a huge amount of empty shelves apart from flour again. So we're happy with how that's worked, and it's really helped us stabilise our supply chain. So I think we learned a lesson last time, and we're pleased we've done it, and it just means that the stores are nice and controlled. It's good.
So, Kitty, you mentioned masks there. So how much demand is there for masks now that we're all being asked to, if we can, wear a mask?
A lot of demand for masks. Over the weekend, actually, that we just had before it was announced in New Zealand that we had a community outbreak, we saw really solid sales of masks. And on Tuesday night and Wednesday, I think we must have sold nearly 500,000 masks, so a lot of masks. And I guess the good thing about that is actually people are wearing them in our stores. In Auckland, I haven't been around the country, obviously, which I think is good. Our team are wearing them, so it feels, if people are doing what's asked of them from the Prime Minister. And I think that's really pleasing to see that people are taking this very seriously, and everyone's sort of, working together to do what we can together to collectively sort of nip this in the bud.
Appreciate your time. That is Kitty Hannafin, who's the spokesperson for Countdown. And just a reminder there, you don't need to panic buy. They're going to stay open, as she said, and lots of stock available. All right, well, today's announcement has had flow-on effects for sporting events. So our sports reporter, Clay Wilson, has joined me in the studio to bring us up to date. Clay, let's start with Super Rugby Aotearoa. What's happening?
Yeah, well, of course, 2 games were set to go ahead this weekend. Just one will be played. As you mentioned earlier, the big Blues Crusaders game on Sunday afternoon has been called off. Now, that's despite the Crusaders having already won the title. There was a huge amount of interest in this game. Eden Park was sold out. The second time Eden Park's been sold out this year for the Blues. So 43,000 people won't get to go to that game on Sunday. A lot of people looking forward to it. Of course, the Blues, a much better team this year, and a chance to get a bit of revenge for their loss to the Crusaders in Christchurch recently. And, of course, that classic Canterbury-Auckland rivalry sort of being built back up, so a real shame that game won't go ahead. Now, tomorrow's game in Dunedin will go ahead, except with a couple of changes. The kick-off time has been moved back from 7 o'clock to 3 o'clock. Now, that's because New Zealand Rugby's agreement with the government means that under Alert Level 2, teams have to fly in and fly out. The visiting teams have to fly in, fly out on the same day. So the Hurricanes will have to fly down tomorrow morning and then play the game and fly back tomorrow night. And, of course, no fans in Forsyth Bar Stadium tomorrow night. They had about 65% of tickets sold as of Wednesday, so they were building towards a pretty big crowd there as well. But none of those fans will get in. So a bit of a shame for them down there as well, but at least they get to see their team play on TV, I suppose.
2 immediate things, Clay. All those people who are now be slightly grumpy that they don't get to go to these wonderful events, are they going to get the money back? Do we know yet?
No, we don't know those details yet. New Zealand Rugby did say that that would be down to the individual franchises, but you would have to think that those people are in line to get full refunds at some point.
OK, the Auckland game, any consideration being given to having it, well, I don't know, in 12 days' time?
That question was asked a couple of days ago when New Zealand Rugby said they were going to wait until today. Doesn't appear they ever really had any real consideration of waiting. The reason given for that is that they've got a pretty busy schedule of things coming up. Wharapama Cup, the women's provincial competition, the big North-South game here in Auckland at the end of the year, and then end of the month, and then the men's NPC starting next month as well. So they basically wanted to get it done this weekend or not at all.
OK, netball still, that's ANZ netball, that's not done either, so what's going to happen there?
Well, New Zealand Netball had already called off the final round of matches, which were due to start tonight, run through till Monday. They'd already called them off. Now, the finals day is due to be played in Invercargill next weekend. Now, of course, Invercargill will be under level 2, which means those games can go ahead, except there won't be any fans allowed. We haven't had an announcement from Netball New Zealand yet, so we don't know what's going to happen. There is some issues, though. There's 2 Auckland teams which are due to go down. Aucklanders can't leave Auckland, of course, so we don't know what's going to happen there. I guess the main thing for them is that the grand finalists come from the Central Pulse in the Wellington region and the Canterbury Tactics. So both of those teams can go, so they can play that grand final at least.
So, Clay, here's the thing, obviously. Sport is a big part of Kiwis' lives, and obviously during lockdown it was absent, and then it came back and it brought a bit of joy. So, and now, well, there's a hole again, isn't there?
Yeah, I think sports fans will be feeling a bit odd, actually. They'll be feeling a bit ripped off, probably. I mean, especially with the Blues Crusaders game, a lot of people were looking forward to that, not just in New Zealand, I think probably around the world. You know, some rugby fans around the world that have been starved of their own competitions. So it is a real shame. It is a bit of a weird feeling that they aren't going to go ahead. And it's going to be weird to watch that Hurricanes-Highlanders game in Dunedin tomorrow without any fans under that big old roof there at Forsyth Bar Stadium. So it is all a bit odd.
Yeah, it's like those weird NBA games that they've got at the moment with sort of digital people in the stands. It's just not the same,
it's
is
not
it?
the same,
Yeah. Hey, thanks for that, Clay. So, as you know, we're going into level 3 lockdown in Auckland for another 12 days. The rest of the country will be at level 2 for the extra 12 days. And we're getting some feedback from you, I think. I don't know where that's quite gone at the moment. So while we look for that, I'm just going to bring you up to date with what we know. So we know that the Prime Minister has also indicated before we come out of lockdown on 11:59 on Wednesday, the 26th of August, that the Cabinet will review the decision on the 21st of August, looking at all the precautionary measures, whether we have managed to ring-fence that cluster, which has now reached 30 people. Some of you are getting in touch about what this all means for students. This person says, Lisa, as a parent of 2 Auckland Grammar students, I find it surprising and somewhat annoying that Auckland Grammar doesn't have classes for years 11 and 13 students from the end of the 3rd term. Maybe Auckland Grammar could use the time from the start of term 4 and the exam season to have the face-to-face time with students and teachers the headmaster says they require. Better that than an outbreak of COVID-19 within the school community. And that's from Diane. So someone else says, so what if the students are at a critical phase in the school year? A bit of an inconvenience for learning and organising exams other than in a classroom is surely not as important as keeping the virus at bay. Thanks for tuning in to this Checkpoint special. As the Prime Minister has indicated, play by the rules and we'll be out of this sooner, potentially, than the 12 days that we are at alert level 3 in Auckland and 2 in the rest of the country.
RNZ News at 7. Good evening, I'm Susana Leatawa. Auckland will remain in COVID-19 alert level 3 and the rest of the country